Welcome to the beginning of Lecture 2 on the Renaissance chapter. In the previous lecture, we talked about what the Renaissance was, historically, what was going on, what Renaissance means. We discussed the Renaissance architecture and some of those fabulous buildings that are still, dominant to the Florentine skyline even today. But the architecture of the Renaissance was not all that was phenomenal from this period. So in this lecture, we're going to be focusing predominantly on Renaissance painting. And I think you're going to see that as we ventured along our timeline, we've come a long way from cave paintings and wall paintings. And this is that period, the Renaissance, where painting really moves forward. And we get some of the greatest paintings in history during this time period. This is truly a time of rebirth and transition when we're talking about painting. The Renaissance artist pioneered a new pictorialism that took inspiration from both that classical antiquity we've been talking about and the evidence of the human eye. Now, the Romans had tried to recreate the look of nature through the use of various illusionistic techniques. This was revived by the Renaissance artists, but in pursuing a rational analysis of the natural world, they moved beyond empirical devices to introduce scientific methods for the representation of objects in space, which transformed the painting into a window on nature. All right, so basically what we're talking about is they're attempting to recreate the look of nature through various illusionist techniques. There's going to be the use of math, okay, and geometry when it comes to actually looking at a subject that you're going to paint as a Renaissance painter and creating this perceived three-dimensional world. So, first of all, let's talk about the picture plane. This is a two-dimensional surface of the panel or the canvas that's being used. It was conceived as a transparent glass or a window, if you will, through which someone could perceive a three-dimensional world. Then there's the concept of linear or one-point perspective. And this satisfied the Renaissance craving for an exact and accurate description of the physical world. This imposed a fixed relationship, both in time and space, between the image and the eye of the beholder, making the latter the exclusive point of reference within the spatial field and metaphorically placing the individual at the center of the macrocosm. Brunelleschi, that we talked about, the one who did that fabulous dome on that Florence church, he formulated the first laws of linear perspective. He projected the picture plane as a cross section through which diagonal lines connected the eye of the beholder with the object along whose lines, and hence with the vanishing point. So if we look, basically, he was looking at the manner in which those parallel lines in a given visual field appear to converge at a single vanishing point on the horizon. So let me see if I can. Nope, sorry. So if we look at our visual here on this slide, all right, so you've got your horizon, okay, and you've got these two parallel lines of vision, and they're going to intersect at one point, and that's the vanishing point. All right. So what I want you to get from this, all right, is that the paintings are starting to take on a new perspective. They are starting to look at the proximity of things in relation to this linear perspective. So we're starting to get this infusion of really wanting to capture the perspective and have that ability in some places to bring us into the painting itself. And you'll see that is in some of the examples that we discussed today. This becomes an important thing. You're going to find in Leonardo da Vinci you're going to find this person who had this amazing mind that was very mathematical, very scientific, but he also had this great creative ability. But he brings that math and science, these linear perspectives, into his paintings. And we'll talk a lot about one of his famous paintings, The Last Supper, that shows that. So a lot of interesting things going on. This fusion, this Renaissance time period where we have these fusions of math and science and creativity. All of these things aren't isolated anymore. They're incorporated into the art form. All right, so one thing we need to talk about with painting is this egg tempera paint. Now, it was a favorite medium of painters during the Middle Ages and the early part of the Renaissance. Now, egg tempera creates images that are crisp and they're clear, they have vivid colors. So they actually would make this paint by using the egg, okay? So you have that yellow of the egg yolk, and when you mix it in with the paint, the yellow of that egg yolk, initially you see that color in the painting, but in about 2 weeks that yolk color bleaches out. The egg tempera is extremely durable as a medium, as a paint, because it's going to become rock hard when it dries. One of the drawbacks, though, is it dries really quickly. So the brush strokes that artists would use when they're using egg tempera are limited in size, okay? They're not making those big, long brush strokes. They're making those small, little, quick brush strokes, trying to beat that paint drying. Now, this is a suitable paint for small-scale, detailed paintings, okay? If they were, if an artist was going to draw or paint a huge canvas, this was not the paint to use for that. You don't have a lot of time to blend colors either as the artist, okay? Because again, this paint dries very quickly because of that egg. So there are convincing illusions of textures that aren't achieved by using this egg tempera. Now, later we're going to see the use of oil paint. It is a game changer, okay? But this egg tempera was a huge favorite during the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. You just had to know its limitations. So the egg tempera technique will gradually be replaced in the early Renaissance by the mixed technique. And the mixed technique is used for a very short time. Now, when we talk about the mixed technique, this actually led to the development of pure oil paint. Using oil paint allows the painter more time. The painter can blend colors and not be worried about those drying out so fast. Oil paint allows them more time not only to blend those colors, but they can also create all these really cool textures and these textural illusions. And it allows the artist to see the final color relationships while they're working, since the color of oils is wet, and when it's wet, it's the same as the dried color, unlike that egg tempera where it had that yellow, which changed the color, and then when it dried, it was a completely different color. So oil paint is going to be, as I mentioned before, this game changer. It's going to allow a lot more freedom, a lot more technique, a lot more opportunity for the painter. So we see that changing from that egg tempera into kind of a mixed technique that will later turn into the oil paint. Now, when we talk about early Renaissance painters, we have to talk about Micassio. He was there was a Florentine painter, Tommaso Guidi, who called Micassio a slovenly Tom. And Micassio was the first artist to master Brunelleschi's new spatial device. All right. He dies at 27, possibly due to poisoning. All right. But in his short time, he demonstrated his remarkable artistic talent in the frescoes that he painted. He would paint frescoes for various churches in Florence. His cycle of frescoes at the Bonacci Chapel in Santa Maria del Carmen represent an elaborate synthesis of illusionistic techniques. One of his most famous pictures as a fresco was the Tribute of Money. So let's take a look at it. Now, he painted this fresco in 1425 in the Braccossi Chapel, the Basilica of Santa Maria del Carmen in Florence, Italy. And the size of it is 97.2 inches by 235 inches. So you see here, here's a wall, but notice how the way that he's painted there's some kind of 3D illusion going on. Now, Micassio worked from live models as well as from the available antique sources. So from classical statuary, such as the Apollo Belvedere, he borrowed that graceful stand of the Roman tax collector, who is shown twice in the frescoes. While the Roman togas and the head of John the Evangelist are on the right side of Jesus. So he would borrow the images from, previous works, whether they be a statue, whether they be another depiction of some sort. So we get to see this Roman graceful stand of the Roman tax collector twice, okay, in this painting. So you see close-ups here, you see Jesus here, you see another depiction of that, or a wider view of that here. You see those Roman togas, right? And the head of John the Evangelist. All right, even though we know that would not be something that you would have seen. So here is another picture. This fresco portrays the life of St. Peter. This is in that same chapel, okay, in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmen in Florence. Now, look at this. I mean, this fresco it doesn't stop where the wall ends. Notice it just continues. So you've got this nice flow. In the corners, he has actually painted columns. Okay, those are not real columns. He has painted them. And so we end up with this beautiful, kind of 3D sort of situation. Here you see, this is all on a flat wall, okay? But you see that this part comes out and it looks very 3D, okay? You see the top level here. Now, the faces of the people in his paintings are individualized, but they're not idealized, and they reflect his models. Real people of the peasant class of Florence were typically his models. So you might see the faces on these individuals in the painting. The faces might actually be of real people from the peasant class in Florence. The story of this lovely fresco is told in continuous narration. So several events that took place sequentially are shown simultaneously. Okay, so some beautiful, beautiful paintings. Another painter we want to talk about is Sandro Botticelli. And he was a follower of Micassio's. And he was less interested in achieving illusionistic effects. He primarily painted religious subjects, and most of these were inspired by the physical beauty of the classical nude. Remember when we studied classical Greek and Rome, and there were periods of time where the body was the focus, the nude body was the focus. A famous one of his works is called The Birth of Venus. All right, and here you see the large picture of that, and then you see a close-up of Venus herself. In this work, you see the features and an idealized image of womankind based on an antique model. possibly a statue in the Medici collection that he may have seen. Now remember the story, the myth of Venus, right? That she was born from a shell, right? Um, so we've got this classical feel to this with some of the newer techniques. This is actually um, tempura, the egg tempura on a large canvas. The composition depends largely on the harmonious integration of line and the use of pastel colors. The figures are only minimally shaded, so that unlike Micassio, they seem weightless. They seem suspended in space. This is basically a tribute to physical and spiritual beauty. Botticelli shows Venus born from the sea foam and floating toward the island of Cythera on a pearlescent scallop shell. To her right are two wind gods locked in a sensuous embrace. You see right here the two wind gods in the embrace. To her right, or actually that was to her left, sorry. To her right is the welcoming figure of Pomona, the ancient Roman goddess of fruit trees and fertility. Many elements in this painting are seen. For example, you see water, you see wind, you see flowers and trees. This suggests that procreation and fertility, those powers associated with Venus as a goddess of an earthly love. Botticelli was inspired, however, by the contemporary Neoplatonic poem that honors Aphrodite or Venus as the goddess of divine love. So she's rendered as an object of ethereal beauty and spiritual love. Now, it's interesting to look at probably what we know to be a self-portrait, maybe, of Botticelli, this painting here. And you notice a lot of the same sort of features and use of color and texture that we see in this picture of him, also in this image as well. Here is another piece by Botticelli. This one's called Primavera. And this is a very, very complex kind of picture. It's got, again, that kind of flowy feel to these beings that are shown on this picture. Focus on the human body, of course. And this one is called, this is tempera paint that was done on a wood panel. You know, not everybody's using canvas yet. And so a lot of them are done on panels. They might be made of wood. They could be made of another type of material, but wood was very common. This one has kind of a dark feel, but also a light and airy feel. This is a complex allegory of spring, the season, taken from the Latin writers, and it demonstrates the Renaissance interest in classical literature and mythology. From right to left, we've got Zephyrus, god of the west wind. He leads, which leads to the nymph Chloris, and then to the goddess of flowers, Flora, who strews the flowers everywhere, right? You've got Venus, the goddess of love. Notice the red, the use of the red drape, because that, gives us that image of love. She provides a central focus with Cupid above, right? Notice some red up here. The Venus, goddess of love, provides a central focus with Cupid shooting an arrow. Below, you've got the three graces. They twirl and whirl, and they send us to Mercury, who holds up his caduceus to stop the viewer at the edge of the composition. All right, so again, we've got red with him, red here, red here. So we've got that continuity. We've got a lot going on in this picture, and the eye is drawn from that right over to the left. So interesting use of color, a lot of symbolism here, ideas of, spring and fruitfulness and all of this. All right, so while Micasio's figures are massive and strongly modeled in light and shade, as we see in this one. Botticelli's are more delicate. Their outlines are stressed and the modeling is limited. His goddesses are weightless and delicate, floating rather than standing. They are the young girlish type that are preferred in the early Renaissance. They have long necks and arms and legs, which are also, you're going to see a lot in this early Renaissance. So in contrast, in the high Renaissance, you're going to see a more mature, full-bodied female figure, as we see in the work of Raphael and Michelangelo. But in this early Renaissance, we see more of the younger, girlish type with the long necks, arms, and legs. So be watching for those things as we move. Now we move into more of these early Renaissance paintings. Pico della Francesca is a very important painter during this early Renaissance. Now, he paired portraits, okay? He's the one that comes up with this profile presentation that was especially popular at the time. So in this example, for example, you will see paired portraits of Battista Forza and her husband Federico. All right. So you notice this profile presentation. You're getting the profile of one, and the other one is in profile facing there. You've got, he is actually a count. He's the ruler of Urbino. He was a gentleman, a scholar, a bibliophile, meaning he loved books. He was shown realistically with warts and all. Gone are the days of just showing an idealized version of someone. Here we get him. I mean, he's got a crooked nose. He's got warts. Okay. He's not the most attractive man in the world, right? Whereas you've got the Countess, she's wearing her sparkling jewels, an elaborate hairdo, and notice her forehead is raised. This was a very common, and it's going to kind of gross you out, ladies. It was a very common practice to pluck out the hair on the forehead, okay? Because it would look like the person had an incredibly high and large forehead, but it was because the women would pluck out those hairs, okay? So we see her forehead, it's raised by the plucking and having her hairline move backwards, which was very popular at the time. But we see this very realistic rendering of these two people. Now, here's something else interesting. Notice the landscape in the back. Okay, so he paints this landscape, a very realistic looking, part of Italy, maybe painted in the background. This is new, this idea of painting that landscape in the back instead of just having these profiles of these individuals with, just a solid color background. So we're starting to really see some interesting things. Now, Fra Angelico means angelic brother. So you've got this artist who both his art and his life were very pious, pure, and perfect. So the life that he led is the life that he portrays in his paintings. He created angelic looking figures inhabiting ethereal realms. And we know they're angelic when we see, these little halos above them, right? For him, and this is really important for Fra Angelico, for him, painting was a form of religious worship. Now, you see between 1438 and 1445, he frescoed much of the monastery in which he lived, and that was the monastery of San Marco in Florence. His greatest interest was in the pictorial expression of devotion. So again, you're going to see in his paintings angelic figures. You're going to see the expression of devotion in these paintings. Now notice some things. Um, Notice in this second picture, this first one is actually a picture or a painting of him, okay? This second one, this is called the Annunciation by Fra Angelico. And again, this is in the monastery of San Marco in Florence, Italy. It was done somewhere between 1438 and 1445. It is a fresco the size of 7 feet 6 inches by 10 feet 5 inches. It is very typical of contemporary early Renaissance architecture. Notice the detail. Not only is this a painting of these two subjects, probably the Holy Mother, right, and this angel, okay? Both of them have their arms in a sign of respect. They've got their arms crossed across their chest. The crossed arms refer to Jesus's cross, prefiguring his crucifixion. But this painting, this fresco, not only depicts these important subjects, but it also depicts the exact depiction of the actual architecture in that in that monastery of San Marco in Florence. So notice you've got these columns and archways, okay? And so we end up with these subjects set in this exact location in this particular piece of architecture. This third one is called the Coronation of the Virgin Mary. All right. The style of this painting is consistently delightful. His figures move gently and gracefully in a lyrical pastel realm. It's painted with meticulous, tiny little brush strokes and very sharp details. And then we've got this bright use of color, right? That just gives a lot more interest to this, but very delicate, gentle, graceful figures. You see individual faces on people, a lot of detail in the painting, the design on the particular fabric, the actual, crowns and any jewels that might be hanging from that. A lot of attention to detail. Now, let's look at this one in particular. This is very typical of contemporary early Renaissance architecture, as we mentioned. You see the composite and ionic orders, and they're supported rounded arches. And again, this is a close-up where you can see more of them crossing their arms, right? You notice the angel is bowing down in submission to Mary. All right, which brings us to early Renaissance sculpture. Never a mere imitation of antique models. You're going to see instead in this early Renaissance sculpture an original effort to reinterpret the Greco-Roman themes and principles. So they're not just imitating, because we've seen that in the past, right? In Rome, we saw them imitating those sculptures of the Greeks, and we've seen throughout history some attempts to imitate some of those. But that's not what this early Renaissance sculpture is about. It's an original effort to reinterpret the themes and principles from that Greco-Roman period. All right, so the most creative force in early Renaissance sculpture was the Florentine artist Donato Bardi, which is he's known as Donatello. Now, this is that part of the course where I tell you you're going to recognize some names of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, okay? But those were named after these famous people in the Renaissance. So Donatello is the most creative force in the early Renaissance sculpture. Now, he traveled with Brunelleschi to Rome to study antique statuary. His efforts in both marble and bronze set the benchmark for technical proficiency and the expression of emotional intensity in three-dimensional representation. Donatello idealized the likeness of the biblical hero David in this particular sculpture. So here we see the face of David, okay? This is the first freestanding life-size nude that had been sculpted since way back in antiquity, way back in Greece or Rome. It's classical in proportion in its stance, yet it's very seductive and sensuous. It's a very idealized likeness of David. All right, not a maybe realistic, but it's very idealized. You see attention to details. Notice the relaxed stance. You've got him with his hand on his hip and the sword just down at his side. You've got at his feet the head of the giant, because remember, David is the one who killed Goliath. So kind of an interesting. Notice we're starting to see great human features being sculpted. Now, a famous piece, and let me show you the picture first. This one is called Mary Magdalene. Now, Donatello worked in both the gentle, elegant style of Giberti, and he developed a very different style of power and force. His figures can be called very harsh. They're harsh almost to the point of being disturbing, projecting greater drama and emotionalism than ever before seen in Italian sculpture. Now, for this, and I'm going to go back to the picture in a second, this was wood that was painted and gilded. And this is now in Florence, Italy, but this is Mary Magdalene by Donatello. Now notice, not a beautiful image. It's very harsh. But it has a lot of great emotion. Notice the hands kind of in prayer. And you've got, a lot of the characteristics of the wrist and the arms and the muscles, but this doesn't necessarily seem like a woman's hands, okay? All right. Now, Donatello's friend and contemporary was Lorenzo Giberti. And we start to see in sculpture not just statues, right? We start to see some beautiful pieces of art that are sculpted and used in architecture. Now, Giberti achieved dramatic effects by applying the laws of linear perspective to humanized narratives, marked by figural grace and atmospheric detail. And so he did these series of panels that were used on a building, okay? These were used on the Florentine baptistery of San Giovanni. These were called the Gates of Paradise. And again, you've got that linear perspective, but very humanized figures. Notice how this one comes out from the piece and actually creates this just very interesting three-dimensional piece. Michelangelo would later comment that these particular doors were worthy of being the actual gates of paradise. Now, that's a pretty big compliment coming from someone who will become one of the greatest artists of all time. Now, in these gates of paradise, and look at the people standing here, okay? That gives you some perspective. One of these panels is like 10 times the size of this guy's head. And we've got, 10 of these panels. There are 10 Old Testament scenes from creation to the reign of Solomon that are depicted. And Giberti signed his landmark work with a portrait bust of himself that protrudes from a roundel midway down the inner frame. So here's like a little self-portrait. So what a cool thing that he did, right? He added himself into this. There's a good use of space in Solomon and Sheba, the panel called Solomon and Sheba. Unlike medieval art, in which the more important figures were made larger, now the relative size reflects the position in space. So again, it's about linear, okay? So as you see in this one, they're not bigger because they were more important. They are bigger because of their place in all of this, okay? The perspective. The foreground figures are larger and in higher relief than those in the background. Action now occurs on many planes in space rather than only in the foreground, and each panel includes several scenes, but the composition of those scenes is unified and the meaning is clear. So we have the same sort of technique used in all of these to provide unity. The same material is used. It's just that each panel tells a different story. Here's the building that it was placed on. The building itself was interesting. It's got this nice, octangle kind of thing going on. And you've got these beautiful doors. You've got the beautiful sculptures above the doors. Now, some other interesting early Renaissance sculpture we got from Verrocchio, and he would sculpt the likeness of people. Like this one is Lorenzo de Medici. Remember the Medici family? They were the ones that were had been kind of in power the longest in Italy, and they were supporters, patrons of the art, and they commissioned people. So this is an interesting likeness. The Renaissance portraiture was the hallmark of the new self-consciousness and the growing civic pride. Here's another one. Here's another statue, the equestrian statue of Bartolomeo Colleoni. This recalls the Roman statue of Marcus Aurelius. Looks a lot like that kind of concept. There's a scientific naturalism, an anatomical attention to detail on the sculpture. So we're starting to see in this early Renaissance some changes in some wonderful things going on in sculpture itself. This concludes our second lecture on the Renaissance. And in our next lecture, we'll be finishing up the chapter and talking about the High Renaissance. Thank you for joining me.